The next thing we're going to talk about here as we deal with the technical side of the camera a little bit is ISO and white balance. Now these are two very specific controls that you have for dealing with specific types of light in your camera. One has to do with the speed of light that you will capture on your sensor, and the other has to do with the quality of light you will have. On the camera sensor sensitivity, that is ISO. In other words, how sensitive do you want that sensor inside your camera to light, whether you're shooting a low light situation or something very bright. And the other is understanding your camera's response to the type of light you are in, whether it be direct sunlight, open shade, whether it be ambient light, or whether it be at twilight. All of these things play into how your camera responds to light and how you capture your image. So first of all, let's take the sensor. ISOs are ratings that qualify the camera's sensitivity to light. In other words, it's a calibration, so to speak. In film, if you're shooting a film camera, you have one ISO speed for every roll of film, and it is rated as such for maximum quality. But in the digital world, you can change it from picture to picture. This is both good and bad news, depending on how you use your camera. So, DSLRs have many different camera speeds. Even the lower end cameras, some of your phones have different ISOs you can set, or you can buy an app for it. These are numeric values given to sensitivity to the sensor. The ISO, the designation, comes from International Standards Organization, which oversees a variety of different measurements, not just ISO. ISO happens to be one of them. Your average DSLR will have ISO speeds or sensitivities from ranges of 100 to some as high as 40,000 ISO. So let's give you an example of how this works. If you had your camera set at an ISO speed of 125, it would be a good general purpose setting. It's relatively slow as the case goes, but it is good for bright light and it is good for some strong detail. If you move that sensor or the setting up to ISO 400, and that's pretty general purpose, but it's a faster speed and it will work better in a lower light situation. The rule for ISO to remember is that the higher the number, the more sensitive it's going to be your camera setting for light. So the lower the light you have, the darker it is, the higher the ISO number you want. The brighter the light, the lower the ISO you want. So here's some various speeds, 100 all the way to 40,000. Now you'll notice if you look closely that most of these, a couple of these are 100 to 160 is a half, but their 100 to 200 is a half or double again, or one stop. 200 to 400 the same, 400 to 800 the same, 1600 and so on, all the way up the scale. This should sound familiar and you'll see it here in just a minute. Sensitivities, the higher the ISO number again, the more sensitive it will be to light. ISO 400 is twice as sensitive as ISO 125. There is a two-stop difference. So if you were out shooting and you had your camera set at ISO setting 400 and your exposure is f5.6 at 1/25th of a second, here as we say in the slide, but if you switch your ISO to the next shot, you switch it to 125, to get the same amount of light hitting the sensor as you had in the previous shot, you would have to adjust two stops to get the same amount of light. Your new setting would be f2.8 at 1/25th of a second. You have a lower ISO, which means it is less sensitive, which means you need more light to accomplish the same task as you did in your first initial exposure. So this should begin to sound all pretty familiar as we went through f-stops, shutter speeds, and all that. ISO is the third pillar of the equation for exposure. Now that last part should sound pretty familiar. The same principle, or half or double, applies to the ISO as it does to f-stops and shutter speeds. Each number is either half as fast as the one that precedes it, or is twice as sensitive as the one that follows it. In other words, as you look at your ISO numbers, remember half or double as you go up and down the scale, and it will help you get through this process. Outdoors bright sun, ISO 100 works pretty well. It's slow and it can give you some slow exposures depending on your shadow patterns and the angle of light, but it is a very good ISO to start working with in bright sunlight. ISO 400 would be for lower light situations like this dust shot with the crop duster or something like that. In other words, you need to be aware of the light conditions you are in to set the appropriate ISO. And then you need to remember as you change in your light conditions, as you change, go back to bright sunlight or whatever, to change your ISO with it. So very low light situations, like even going indoors, which many people like to do, you're going to need an ISO of 1600 or maybe 3200 or even higher to make a decent picture. Shooting inside at the level you're at right now is probably not a good idea. It's better to stay outside and master the light outside before moving inside. So knowing your ISO strengths is important. Understanding your camera and your sensor can only improve your shooting. It will allow you to work different situations with different light and get dramatically different results, which is what we're after. So light quality or brightness, which is what your sensor is really looking for, or what your meter is actually telling you is the brightness of a subject, is always measured in candle power. Now, a good example of this is the single candle has great effect on a low light situation. This demonstrates one of the most important qualities of light, and that is the power of light. Very important. So this brings us to our second point that we're dealing with in the quality of light, and that is, how does your camera interpret the light? ISO is a calibration that you set for the light level that you're going to capture in, giving you a better opportunity to capture something in a low light situation or improve quality in a bright situation. But white balance is something different. This sets your tonality of the light that you're in. White balance is a calibrated response by the camera to whatever light you are in. It's extremely important. Now, most cameras today have a variety of settings to deal with white balance, or WB as designated on your camera. They have to do with the type of light that you're in and the differences the type of light will make on the sensor, because again, the camera is a machine and it will only respond to what you give it or how you set it. Okay? Yeah, you can set your camera on totally auto, and like I've said before, you'll end up just being a walking tripod. And you'll get decent results with modern DSLRs because they're very good. But if you master these controls, you can improve your creativity and the quality of your images greatly. Again, you have control over the white balance, and you need to understand these settings. So there are very different types of light. Now I'm going to break them down into a few categories here, and you could break them down even further. But the first one, and the one we shoot most often in, is direct sunlight. And this is the one that we are most used to. We like, as humans, we like to see direct sunlight. We like to see things lit like direct sunlight. Hence, when you do a portrait, there's always a big light above shooting down at you, so the light casts on the different side across to cast a shadow behind you. That's because we like to see things lit by the sun. It is natural. The second, though, is cloudy and overcast. This is a totally different type of light. It's much bluer. Obviously, it's going to be a slower ISO. It has different properties of light, as you can see in these two photographs right here side by side. This is very good for portraiture. And colors look more saturated in cloudy or overcast situations. Now, some of you would argue and say, oh no, the picture here you show on the right is much more vivid. That is contrast. It's not necessarily the saturation of colors. The third we talk about would be open shade. Now, open shade is where there is no direct sunlight hitting the subject whatsoever. Everything is somewhat reflected off different surfaces, like these flowers here. The third is ambient light or reflected light, where the light is virtually affected by all the things around it. Again, a very reflective and highly reflective type of light that can give a very moody interpretation, as you can see as we walk through these photographs. And the last one is fluorescent or tungsten. Now, this is man-made light, and your flash unit on your camera is tungsten. Fluorescent lights, like in schoolrooms or office buildings, things like that. Man-made light. Now, in fluorescent, they have all kinds of different settings or all different kinds of tubes of fluorescent lights, and your cameras, your DSLRs, have the capability to be calibrated for specific different fluorescent bulbs, whether they be daylight or tungsten or setting or yellow or blue. And I saw a camera the other day that had 24 settings for fluorescent lights because they're so common now. Very, very interesting. So each of these can pose special problems for the photographer as far as white balance and interpretation. And our mastery of this, of understanding how white balance works, will make a difference. So let's just get down to the basics of white balance. Most of us shoot in auto white balance. I shoot in auto white balance sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And cameras are very good to balance the light and give you a good interpretation. However, sometimes you need to change the white balance to get the right look. It is in these two pictures here. The one is obviously above, is obviously way too blue. However, if you're just looking on the LCD screen on the back of your camera, you may think it's okay, but once you get in the computer, you'd realize that those greens in those trees are not really greens. The photograph on the bottom is the correct exposure and the correct color. Here's a really good example of how white balance works. White balance goes out, looks at the scene that you point the camera at, if you're in auto white balance, and it searches for something white. Now, on the left, the white balance is fooled because, well, there's nothing white out there. And this is one of the things where people get in trouble with their cameras. Auto white balance is just that. It will treat it automatically. If there is nothing white, it will make its best guess. And it will place a profile accordingly, or it will change the colors accordingly to its best guess of what it thinks it ought to be. The photograph on the right reads the clouds in the distance as the white balance and gives you a correct interpretation of these hills. It is important to know that these two photographs were shot moments apart of the very same rocks. Different position, granted, they moved around, but look at the difference in the color and contrast of these. And this is with auto white balance on both situations. So the thing to remember is that auto white balance can be fooled. It is not set it and forget it, like I've said. It's the same thing with autofocus. It is not set it and forget it. It can be fooled. So it's important that you have a basic understanding of light and how it works so that you can treat light in front of you correctly. So first of all, let's look at the electromagnetic spectrum. This is the culmination of all visible light you can see. Now, light, as I'm sure you learned in 8th grade physics class or 8th grade science, is they come in light waves. Well, there's lots of things that come in waves, light waves. There's radio waves, heat waves, radar, cellular, microwaves, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet. And guess what? We can't see those things. But we can see the spectrum, a very small, tiny spectrum of violet, blue, green, yellow, and red. And these, which are the colors of the rainbow, obviously, these are what make up all the colors that you see by your naked eye. 160 million scientists tell us that we can see with our naked eye. The camera, by contrast, can capture about 16 or 17 million. So our camera can capture about 10 or 12% of all the different tones that we can see. Pretty amazing. But all light is generated by this narrow spectrum of what we can see, and everything on the outside of that spectrum is invisible to us, but around us. All these different colors have different candle powers and temperatures, color temperatures. Photographers, you will hear lots of times talking about color temperature of different backgrounds or materials or things like that. What they're talking about is the color interpretation of that subject. So a candle flame is 1500 degrees Kelvin, whereas a blue sky is 9,000 degrees Kelvin. Okay, so obviously the blue sky is a higher number on the candle scale. An easy way to think about this is a yellow flame versus a blue flame. You all know, since a kid, that you don't put your hand on a gas stove with a blue flame. You're going to burn really quickly. But a yellow flame, you're going to burn, still going to burn, but you're going to burn slower. That's why you can pass your finger over a match and it doesn't really get to you, but you put your hand close to a blue flame on a gas stove and it hurts. You can feel it very quickly. One is hotter than the other. The same idea is true with light. And these are the numeric values that are associated with degrees Kelvin. Okay, so it's one thing to know all the technical aspects of how this works as far as white balance and ISO, but it's another thing to actually put it into practice. So let's take a logical problems to solve here in regarding the moon. Now, many of you maybe have tried to shoot the moon in the past. Okay, it's not as easy as it sounds, and yet the way to solve that problem is quite easy. Okay, but you have to use basic logic. How you shoot the moon is by using something called the basic daylight exposure. The basic daylight exposure states that in direct sunlight, the correct shutter speed and f-stop combination for any subject will be f16 at a shutter speed set to as close to your chosen ISO as you can get. So an example of that would be if you used ISO 100 film, any scene in direct sunlight, the exposure would be f16 at 1/125th of a second, and this would give you a satisfactory exposure. So how does this apply to the moon? Okay, well, the moon is surrounded by darkness. It's the middle of the night. This is not going to be easy exposure, right? Wrong. Though the moon is surrounded by this darkness, what is the face of the moon lit by? That's right, sunlight. And if it's lit by sunlight, can I not use the basic daylight exposure to give me the correct exposure? And the answer is yes. So the correct exposure for the moon is the basic daylight exposure, regardless of what ISO you are using. So for instance, if you were using ISO 400, the exposure for the moon would be f16 at 1/500th of a second, and you will get a good result. Now, to get exposures like this, you obviously have to know ISO, sensor sensitivity, white balance, how your camera is going to interpret the light. Even it's good to know even if you're using auto, but you do have control over different types of ways of using white balance. And you have to use logic to solve many of the problems. So it's not just setting your camera. It is thinking it through technically and logically every time.